Picture this. You're 22 years old, fresh out of military training, standing guard at one of the most prestigious locations in Britain. Your uniform is pressed to perfection, your boots shine like mirrors, and your heart pounds with the weight of responsibility. You've memorized every protocol, every face that matters, every rule that keeps the monarchy safe. Then, a man in civilian clothes approaches your checkpoint. No entourage, no obvious security detail. Just an ordinary-looking gentleman with graying hair and a patient smile. He doesn't look like the pictures you've studied. He's smaller than you imagined, more weathered, more human. "Good morning," he says simply. You don't recognize him. The training kicks in. Protocol is protocol. No exceptions. "Sir, I'll need to see some identification." The man pauses. Not angry, not offended, almost amused. Behind him, you notice other people stopping, staring, some pulling out phones. A woman gasps audibly. A child tugs at his mother's sleeve, pointing. And then it hits you. You just asked the King of England for his ID. This is the true story of what happened next. A moment that changed everything for a young guard named James Mitchell, and revealed something unexpected about the man who wears the crown. It's a story about duty, humanity, and the day protocol met grace in the most unlikely way. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the moments we get everything wrong. James Mitchell had always dreamed of serving something bigger than himself. Growing up in a small town in Yorkshire, where the most exciting thing that happened was the annual sheep festival, he watched the royal ceremonies on television with wide eyes and an imagination that stretched far beyond the rolling hills of his childhood. His grandmother, Edith, would sit beside him during every royal broadcast, her weathered hands folded in her lap, explaining the traditions with the reverence of someone who remembered when the Queen was young. "That's not just pageantry, love," she would say, pointing at the guards in their pristine uniforms. "That's history walking. Every button on those uniforms, every step they take, it all means something. They're not just guarding buildings, James. They're guarding everything we are." Those words stayed with him through comprehensive school, through the awkward teenage years when his friends were more interested in football and video games than royal protocols. While other boys collected trading cards, James collected newspaper clippings of state visits and ceremonial events. His bedroom wall was covered with images of the changing of the guard, royal weddings, and state funerals. His mother, Sarah, worried he was becoming too obsessed, but his father, David, understood. David had served in the Royal Navy for 12 years before settling into civilian life as a postman. He recognized the call to service in his son's eyes. "Service isn't just a job, son," David would tell him during their long walks across the Yorkshire moors. "It's a way of being. When you serve something greater than yourself, you become part of something that will outlast you." The monarchy isn't perfect, but it represents continuity, tradition, something that binds us all together. When James turned 16, he began his preparation in earnest. Physical fitness became his obsession. Every morning before school, he would run 5 miles through the countryside, his breath forming clouds in the cold Yorkshire air. He studied history, protocol, and etiquette with the dedication of a scholar. His teachers were bemused but supportive, understanding that this quiet, determined boy had found his calling. The application process for the Royal Guard was grueling. Physical tests that pushed his body to its limits, psychological evaluations that probed every corner of his mind, and interviews that tested not just his knowledge, but his character. James approached each challenge with a methodical determination that had carried him through years of preparation. When other candidates complained about the intensity, James embraced it. This was what separated those who dreamed from those who achieved. His family drove down to London for his passing out ceremony. Edith, now 83 and walking with a cane, insisted on making the journey despite her arthritis. As she watched her grandson march in formation, his uniform immaculate, his bearing proud and strong, tears streamed down her cheeks. "Look at him, Sarah," she whispered to his mother. "Our boy is history now." The training at Wellington Barracks was unlike anything James had experienced. The precision required was astronomical. Every movement had to be exact, every response automatic. They learned the faces of every member of the royal family, every significant dignitary, every person who might legitimately approach a royal residence. Hours were spent studying photographs, watching video footage, memorizing the subtle differences that separated authorized personnel from potential threats. Sergeant Major Williams, a man whose presence could silence a room with a glance, was their instructor in protocol. "You are not just guards," he would bark at the new recruits. "You are the first line of defense for 1,000 years of history. Every decision you make reflects on the crown, on the nation, and on every guard who has stood watch before you. Hesitation can be deadly, but overreaction can be catastrophic. You must learn to read people, situations, threats in seconds. Lives depend on your judgment." The weight of that responsibility settled on James like a heavy cloak. During night shifts, when the barracks were quiet and he lay in his narrow bunk, he would think about all the guards who had come before him. Men who had stood watch during the Blitz, who had protected the royal family through wars and revolutions, who had maintained their posts despite personal cost and sacrifice. He was joining a brotherhood that stretched back centuries, each member bound by the same oath, the same commitment to duty above self. His first assignment was at St. James's Palace, a posting that filled him with both pride and terror. The palace, with its Tudor brick and ancient windows, breathed history. Walking through its corridors for the first time in uniform, James felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Every stone had witnessed moments that shaped the nation. Kings had been born and buried here. Decisions that changed the course of history had been made in these very rooms. The other guards took him under their wing with the gruff affection typical of military men. Corporal Davies, a Welshman with 15 years of service, became his informal mentor. "The thing about this job," Davies told him during a quiet moment, "is that most of the time, nothing happens. You stand, you watch, you follow protocol. But you have to be ready for the moment when everything changes. The moment when your training, your judgment, your courage is tested. Most guards serve their entire careers without facing that moment. But you have to be ready for it every single day." James absorbed this wisdom along with everything else. He learned the rhythm of royal life, the ebb and flow of official duties and private moments. He memorized the faces of staff members, the schedules of regular visitors, the subtle signs that indicated when security levels needed to be heightened. He studied the royals themselves, not with the fascination of a fan, but with the analytical eye of a professional protector. King Charles was still relatively new to the throne, having waited longer than any heir in British history to assume the crown. The transition had been smooth, but significant. New protocols, new schedules, new security concerns. The king, James learned, was more informal than his mother had been, more likely to engage with staff and guards in casual conversation. This was noted in their briefings as both an opportunity and a challenge. Informality could create openings for threats, but it also allowed for better communication and relationship building. The photographs they studied showed King Charles in various official contexts: state ceremonies, formal portraits, official visits. Always surrounded by the pomp and circumstance of royalty, always clearly identifiable as the monarch. James memorized every angle of his face, every characteristic gesture, every detail that would allow instant recognition in any circumstance. What the photographs didn't show, what the briefings couldn't convey, was how different a person could look when stripped of all the royal regalia. How a king in civilian clothes, walking alone, could appear to be just another well-dressed gentleman of a certain age. This was a gap in their training that no one had anticipated, a blind spot that would prove significant. As James settled into his role, his confidence grew. He handled routine situations with ease, from directing lost tourists to managing the constant stream of official visitors. His superiors noted his professionalism and attention to detail. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of guard the royal household wanted: dedicated, observant, unflappable. His family visited him at his post whenever possible, his grandmother Edith insisting on the trip despite her advancing age and failing health. She would stand at the palace gates, beaming with pride at the sight of her grandson in his magnificent uniform, representing everything she believed in about duty, service, and tradition. "You're living our dreams, love," she would tell him. "Every day you stand there, you're honoring something bigger than all of us." James carried those words with him through long shifts and challenging days. When tourists were rude or dismissive, when the weather was brutal, when the hours stretched endlessly, he remembered why he was there. He was part of something eternal, something that connected him to centuries of service and sacrifice. The irony was that his very dedication, his absolute commitment to protocol and procedure, would soon put him in a situation that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Because sometimes doing your job perfectly can lead to the most imperfect of moments. And sometimes those moments reveal truths that change everything you thought you knew about duty, respect, and what it really means to serve. Tuesday, October 17th started like any other morning for James Mitchell. The autumn air carried that crisp bite that reminded him of Yorkshire mornings, though the London streets were already humming with traffic and pedestrians rushing to work. He had been on duty for 3 months now, long enough for the initial nervousness to fade, but not long enough for complacency to set in. Every morning, he approached his post with the same methodical preparation that had carried him through training. His shift began at 6 a.m., when the city was still shaking off sleep and the tourists hadn't yet descended on the royal quarter. This was James's favorite time, when the historic streets belonged to the locals and the early joggers, where he could appreciate the weight of history without the constant distraction of cameras and crowds. The morning briefing had been routine. No special events scheduled, standard security protocols in effect, weather forecasts calling for intermittent rain. St. James's Palace in the early morning had a different character than during the busy afternoon hours. The ancient bricks seemed to absorb the soft light, and the sounds of his fellow guards' footsteps echoed differently in the courtyard. James took his position at the main entrance, his uniform immaculate, his posture perfect, his mind alert but calm. The first few hours passed without incident. The usual parade of early morning staff arrived, their faces familiar now, their credentials checked with professional efficiency. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who managed flower arrangements for state functions, smiled warmly as she presented her identification. "Good morning, James," she said, using his name in the friendly way that still surprised him. Before this assignment, he had been just another face in the crowd. Now he was part of the permanent landscape of royal life. By 9 o'clock, the tourist groups were beginning to appear. School children on educational trips, their teachers herding them like flocks of excited sheep. Elderly couples consulting guidebooks and pointing at architectural details. Amateur photographers trying to capture the perfect shot of the guards in their ceremonial uniforms. James had learned to maintain his stoic expression while simultaneously staying aware of everything happening around him. Tourists were generally harmless, but they could also provide cover for those with less innocent intentions. The morning briefing had mentioned that King Charles had no official engagement scheduled until the afternoon, when he would attend a charity function in Westminster. This meant the palace would maintain its standard operating procedures, with no need for heightened security or special protocols. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of quiet Tuesday that allowed guards to focus on routine duties without the pressure of major events. James was checking the credentials of a delivery person when he noticed a man approaching the main entrance. There was nothing immediately remarkable about him. He appeared to be in his 70s, well-dressed, but not ostentatiously so, walking with the measured pace of someone who knew where he was going. He wore a simple gray suit, carried no briefcase or obvious official materials, and, most significantly, was unaccompanied by any security detail or entourage. In his 3 months on duty, James had learned that important visitors always traveled with some form of accompaniment. Government ministers arrived with civil servants and protection officers. Foreign dignitaries came with translators and security teams. Even minor royals typically had at least one aide or protection officer nearby. This man was entirely alone, which immediately placed him in the category of private citizen requiring standard identification procedures. As the man drew closer, James noticed other pedestrians beginning to slow their pace. A woman walking her dog had stopped entirely and was staring. Two joggers had paused mid-stride, their conversation dying away. A teenager across the street was fumbling with his phone, trying to activate the camera function. This pattern of behavior might have been a clue, but James was focused on the approaching individual and standard protocol requirements. The man reached the checkpoint with a pleasant smile. "Good morning," he said simply, his voice carrying the refined accent of upper-class Britain. His manner was entirely natural, neither demanding special treatment nor showing any impatience with the security procedures. James responded with professional courtesy. "Good morning, sir. How may I assist you?" "I'd like to enter the palace, please," the man replied, his tone suggesting this was a perfectly reasonable request that should present no difficulties. This was where James's training kicked in automatically. No one entered St. James's Palace without proper authorization and identification. No exceptions, regardless of how legitimate they might appear. The protocol was clear and non-negotiable. Verify identity, check authorization, ensure compliance with security requirements. The fact that the man seemed entirely comfortable making this request without immediately producing credentials was actually slightly concerning from a security perspective. "I'll need to see some identification, sir, and verify your appointment," James said, maintaining his professional demeanor while internally running through the checklist of standard procedures. The man's expression shifted slightly, not to annoyance or anger, but to something that looked almost like amusement. His eyebrows raised a fraction of an inch, and the corner of his mouth twitched as if he were suppressing a smile. This reaction was puzzling. Most people, when asked for identification at a royal residence, either produced it immediately or showed some form of irritation at the delay. This man seemed almost entertained by the request. "Of course," the man said, beginning to reach into his jacket pocket. But he moved slowly, his eyes fixed on James's face with an expression that was becoming increasingly difficult to interpret. It wasn't hostile or challenging, but there was definitely something unusual about his demeanor. It was at this moment that James began to hear murmurs from the gathering crowd of onlookers. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakably excited, even shocked. A woman behind him gasped audibly. Someone else said something that sounded like "oh my God," though the words were too distant to be certain. The man paused in reaching for his identification, his hand halfway to his pocket. "Is everything quite all right?" he asked, glancing at the crowd that was steadily growing larger and more animated. Several people now had their phones out, openly filming the interaction. James followed the man's gaze and felt a moment of confusion. Crowds gathered around royal residences all the time, but this felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of witnessing something significant. But what could be significant about a routine identification check? "Sir, if you could just provide your identification," James repeated, trying to maintain focus on his duties despite the increasingly distracting crowd. "I need to verify your identity and check the appointment list." The man's face broke into a genuine smile now, the kind of expression that transformed his entire appearance. "My dear fellow," he said, his voice warm with what could only be described as affection, "I rather think there might be a small misunderstanding here." Behind James, he could hear Corporal Davies approaching, his footsteps quick but controlled. Davies had obviously noticed the growing crowd and was coming to investigate. This was standard procedure when any situation began to attract unusual attention. But Davies stopped short about 10 feet away, and James heard him make a sound that might have been a stifled laugh or a sharp intake of breath. "James," Davies called out, his voice carrying a note that James had never heard before. It wasn't alarm exactly, but it wasn't routine either. "Perhaps you might want to take a closer look at our visitor." The suggestion confused James. He was looking at their visitor, an elderly gentleman in a gray suit, well-spoken, polite, but completely without proper credentials or authorization. What was he supposed to be seeing that he wasn't seeing? The man in the gray suit extended his hand in a gesture that was somehow both formal and friendly. "Perhaps I should introduce myself properly," he said. "I am Charles Windsor. I believe this is my house." The words hit James like a physical blow. Charles Windsor. The name processed in his mind with agonizing slowness, each syllable connecting to recognition that should have been immediate. Charles Windsor. King Charles III. The man he had been trained to recognize, to protect, to serve. The man whose photograph he had studied countless times. The man who was standing in front of him, in civilian clothes, without security, asking politely for identification to enter his own palace. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. James felt his face flush with heat. His heart began to pound in a rhythm that seemed deafeningly loud. The crowd's murmurs now made perfect sense. The phones pointed in his direction weren't capturing a routine security check. They were recording the moment a guard asked the King of England to prove who he was. "Your Majesty," James managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand moved automatically to salute, but the gesture felt clumsy and inadequate. Everything he had been trained to do, every protocol he had memorized, suddenly seemed insufficient for this moment. King Charles waved away the attempted salute with a gentle gesture. "No need for formality," he said. "You're doing exactly what you should be doing. I should have brought some identification." He glanced at the crowd, which was now substantial and still growing. "Though I suspect we might have attracted rather more attention than either of us intended." James was struggling to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. Kings didn't approach palace entrances alone. They didn't walk up without security details and entourages. They certainly didn't stand patiently while guards asked them for identification. Yet here was King Charles III, looking nothing like the formal photograph James had memorized, behaving with a casual normalcy that had completely thrown off every recognition protocol. "I'm terribly sorry, Your Majesty," James said, his training finally kicking in enough to provide appropriate words. "I didn't recognize." He stopped, realizing how that sentence would end and how inadequate any explanation would sound. "No apology necessary," the king replied, and his tone was genuinely reassuring. "In fact, I'm rather impressed. You followed protocol exactly as you should have. It's refreshing to know that security procedures are being maintained regardless of circumstances." But even as the king spoke these kind words, James could see the situation spiraling beyond his control. The crowd had grown to perhaps 50 people, with more arriving every moment. The phones capturing video would undoubtedly post this interaction on social media within minutes. By afternoon, the story of the guard who didn't recognize the king would be circulating around the world. Davies had approached close enough to take control of the situation. "Your Majesty," he said with perfect protocol, "please allow me to escort you inside. We apologize for any inconvenience." King Charles nodded but turned back to James. "What's your name, young man?" "James Mitchell, Your Majesty," James replied, his voice stronger now, but still carrying the tremor of shock. "Well, James Mitchell," the king said, "you've done nothing wrong today. In fact, you've done everything right. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." With that, King Charles followed Davies toward the palace entrance, leaving James standing at his post with a crowd of onlookers, a collection of phone cameras, and the growing realization that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The immediate aftermath of the incident unfolded with the relentless speed of modern media. Within 30 minutes of King Charles disappearing into the palace, James could hear his phone buzzing incessantly in his pocket. By lunchtime, the video had been posted on multiple social media platforms with captions ranging from "Guard doesn't recognize his own king" to "the most awkward royal encounter ever." By mid-afternoon, news organizations were calling it everything from a security breach to a touching moment of humanity. James remained at his post for the remainder of his shift, though concentrating on his duties became increasingly difficult as the crowd of onlookers swelled throughout the day. Tourists who had heard about the incident were making deliberate detours to see the guard who stopped the king. Some were sympathetic, offering encouraging smiles and thumbs up. Others seemed to view him as a curiosity, a living exhibit of royal protocol gone wrong. A few were openly mocking, making jokes about British efficiency and royal recognition skills. Sergeant Major Williams appeared at James's shoulder around 2 o'clock, his expression unreadable. "Mitchell," he said quietly, "report to my office at the end of your shift. And ignore the circus out here. Keep your eyes on your duties." The remaining hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. James had never been so aware of being watched, of every gesture being potentially captured and analyzed. His normally automatic responses to tourist questions became stilted and self-conscious. The confident bearing that had carried him through 3 months of service felt fragile and artificial. When his replacement arrived at 6 p.m., James walked through the palace corridors with the heavy steps of a man approaching his own execution. The other guards he passed offered varying responses. Some avoided eye contact entirely, others gave him sympathetic nods, and a few seemed barely able to contain their amusement. None of them spoke, which somehow made the silence more oppressive than any commentary would have been. Sergeant Major Williams's office was exactly as James remembered it from his first day. Meticulously organized, dominated by photographs of royal ceremonies and military honors, designed to remind visitors of the weight and dignity of their responsibilities. Williams sat behind his desk, a stack of newspapers spread before him, each one featuring a different photograph of the morning's encounter. "Sit down, Mitchell," Williams said without looking up from the papers. "I imagine you've had quite a day." James sat in the straight-back chair facing the desk, his posture automatically correcting itself despite his emotional exhaustion. "Yes, sir," he replied, unsure whether agreement was an admission of guilt or simply acknowledgement of facts. Williams finally looked up, his expression softer than James had expected. "Tell me exactly what happened this morning. Start from when you first noticed the individual approaching your checkpoint." James recounted the events with military precision, leaving out no detail, including no interpretation or excuse. He described the man's appearance, his demeanor, the absence of any security escort, the standard protocol he had followed, and the moment of recognition that had come far too late. Williams listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad beside him. When James finished, Williams leaned back in his chair. "You followed protocol exactly as trained," he said. "Your mistake, if we can call it that, was in not recognizing His Majesty out of official context. This raises some interesting questions about our training methods." This wasn't the response James had expected. He had prepared for discipline, possibly dismissal, certainly a sharp reprimand about the importance of royal recognition. Instead, Williams seemed to be analyzing the incident as a systemic issue rather than a personal failure. "Sir, I should have recognized him," James said. "I studied the photographs. I knew the protocols. There's no excuse." Williams picked up one of the newspapers and turned it toward James. The photograph showed King Charles in full ceremonial dress, surrounded by the pageantry of a state occasion. Then he picked up his phone and showed James a frame from the morning's video. The same man in a simple gray suit, looking like any well-dressed gentleman of his generation. "Look at these two images," Williams said. "How different do they appear?" James studied both images and began to understand Williams's point. The formal photographs that had formed the basis of his training showed King Charles as in figure of ceremony and state, clearly identifiable by context as much as by appearance. The casual civilian clothes, the absence of any royal regalia, the lack of formal setting had created an entirely different visual impression. "The training photographs we use are all from official contexts," Williams continued. "State ceremonies, formal portraits, official visits. We've never prepared guards to recognize royalty in purely civilian contexts." This morning exposed a significant gap in our protocols. James felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Was he being absolved of responsibility, or was this preparation for a more serious consequence? Williams seemed to read his uncertainty. "You're not in trouble, Mitchell," Williams said directly. "In fact, your response to the situation has generated considerable interest from very senior levels. His Majesty himself has requested a meeting with you." The words hit James like another shockwave. "A meeting, sir?" "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, in the King's private study." You'll be escorted by Corporal Davies. Uniform will be dress ceremonial. Williams paused. I'm told His Majesty was quite impressed with your professionalism under pressure. That evening, James sat in his small flat in South London, staring at his phone as messages continued to pour in from friends, family, and strangers. His grandmother Edith had called 6 times, torn between pride that her grandson had met the king and worry about the circumstances. His mother was alternately concerned about his job security and amazed that he was suddenly famous. His father, with characteristic military pragmatism, simply said, "You did your job, son." That's all anyone can ask. The media coverage was wildly varied in tone and interpretation. Some outlets treated it as a security embarrassment, questioning how guards could fail to recognize the monarch they were sworn to protect. Others found humor in the situation, creating memes and jokes about royal identity crises. A few thoughtful commentators used the incident to discuss the balance between security and accessibility in modern monarchy. But it was the comments from ordinary people that affected James most deeply. Hundreds of messages expressed support for his professionalism, admiration for his dedication to duty, and appreciation that he had treated the king like any other citizen when it came to following security protocols. Many noted that this was exactly what they would want their guards to do, apply rules consistently regardless of who was involved. James went to bed that night, with his mind racing through possible scenarios for the next morning's meeting. Would the king express disappointment in his performance? Would there be consequences he hadn't yet been told about? Was this meeting a formal reprimand disguised as a courtesy? Despite Williams's reassurances, James couldn't shake the feeling that his career might hang in the balance of whatever conversation awaited him. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to match James's anxious mood. He dressed in his ceremonial uniform with extra care, every button polished, every crease perfect. If this was to be his final appearance before the king as a serving guard, he would ensure it met the highest standards. Corporal Davies met him at the appointed time, his own manner suggesting that this was not a routine escort duty. "Relax, James," he said as they walked through the palace corridors. "His Majesty isn't known for harsh judgments. If anything, I suspect you'll find this meeting quite different from what you're expecting." The private study was smaller and more intimate than James had imagined. Books lined the walls, family photographs sat on side tables, and everything felt more like a comfortable living room than a royal office. King Charles rose from behind a modest desk as they were announced, gesturing for James to sit in an armchair opposite him. "James," the king said warmly, "thank you for coming. I trust you've recovered from our little adventure yesterday morning." "Yes, Your Majesty," James replied, though his voice carried more nervousness than he would have liked. King Charles sat down and leaned forward slightly, his manner entirely conversational. "I want to speak with you personally because I think yesterday's encounter illustrates something quite important about duty and service. You followed your training exactly as you should have. You treated me as you would treat any citizen approaching a royal residence without proper identification. That's not a failure of recognition. That's a success of principle." James felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he remained uncertain about where this conversation was leading. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who recognize me instantly," the king continued. "Sometimes I wonder if that recognition comes from genuine respect or simply from the symbols of monarchy that surround me. Yesterday, you judged me on my actions and credentials, not on my title or position. That's refreshing." The king paused, looking out the window at the courtyard where James had stood guard the day before. "I've decided to use this incident as an opportunity to review our security protocols. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you've highlighted an area where our training might be improved. How do we prepare guards to recognize royalty in all contexts, not just formal ones? How do we balance security with accessibility? These are important questions." James found his voice enough to ask, "What will happen to me, Your Majesty?" King Charles smiled. "You'll continue your duties, of course. But I'm also asking you to work with our security team to help develop new training protocols. Your perspective, as someone who experienced this situation firsthand, will be invaluable. The relief that flooded through James was almost overwhelming. Not only was he keeping his position, but he was being asked to help improve the very system that had created yesterday's confusion. "There's one more thing," the king added. "I understand your grandmother watched our encounter on the news. I believe she's rather proud of you, despite the circumstances. Or perhaps because of them." James couldn't suppress a smile. "She is, Your Majesty. She said I was upholding the traditions she taught me about treating everyone with equal respect." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," the king replied. "Perhaps we should all remember that the greatest honor we can show the monarchy is to apply its principles consistently, regardless of circumstances." As James left the meeting, his mind was spinning with the unexpected turn his career had taken. What had begun as a moment of apparent failure had become an opportunity to contribute to something larger than himself. The incident that could have ended his service had instead deepened his understanding of what true service meant. 6 months after the incident that had thrust him into unexpected prominence, James Mitchell found himself in a position he could never have imagined. The young guard who had asked the king for identification was now leading training sessions for new recruits, helping to develop protocols that would prevent future misunderstandings while maintaining the essential security standards that protected the royal family. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the weeks following his meeting with King Charles, James had worked closely with senior security officials, psychologists, and training specialists to analyze exactly what had gone wrong and how similar situations could be managed better in the future. The process had been both educational and humbling, forcing him to examine not just his own actions, but the entire system of royal protection. The new training program that emerged from this analysis was revolutionary in its approach. Instead of relying solely on formal photographs and ceremonial contexts, guards now studied images of royalty in casual settings, civilian clothes, and everyday situations. They learned to recognize facial features, posture, and mannerisms that would remain consistent regardless of context. Most importantly, they were taught to balance security protocols with the understanding that even correct procedures could sometimes create awkward situations. The goal, James would tell each new group of trainees, is not to avoid ever asking for identification. The goal is to handle whatever situation arises with professionalism, respect, and dignity. Sometimes that means following protocol even when it feels uncomfortable. Sometimes it means adapting quickly when you realize you made an error. What matters is how you conduct yourself throughout the process. His own conduct during the original incident had become something of a case study. Security experts analyzed the video footage frame by frame, noting how James had maintained his professional demeanor even as the situation became increasingly surreal. His calm insistence on proper identification, his courteous treatment of what he believed to be a civilian visitor, and his graceful handling of the recognition moment had all been exemplary. The media attention had gradually shifted from mockery to admiration. Initial headlines about the guard who didn't recognize the king had evolved into stories about duty, professionalism, and the human side of royal protocol. James had become an unlikely symbol of the principle that good security meant treating everyone equally, regardless of their perceived status or importance. International media had picked up the story, with security experts from other countries praising the British system that had produced a guard willing to challenge anyone, even the monarch, who didn't follow proper procedures. American Secret Service trainers requested copies of the incident analysis. French Republican Guard officers studied the video footage to understand how protocol could be maintained while preserving dignity for all parties involved. James's family had navigated the attention with typical Yorkshire stoicism. His grandmother Edith, now 84 and increasingly frail, had become something of a local celebrity herself. Neighbors would stop her on the street to ask about her famous grandson, and she would regale them with stories of the boy who had always known he was meant for something special. He stood up to the king and treated him like a proper person, she would say with obvious pride. That's what real respect looks like. His parents had been more cautious about the publicity, worried about the pressure it might place on their son's career. But as the months passed and James's role evolved into something more substantial and meaningful, they began to understand that the incident had been a catalyst rather than a catastrophe. Their son hadn't just survived a moment of professional embarrassment. He had helped transform an entire training system. The changes extended beyond just recognition training. James's experience had highlighted the importance of psychological preparedness for unexpected situations. New guards now participated in scenario-based exercises where they encountered royalty in various contexts, from formal state occasions to casual encounters. They learned to manage their own stress responses, to think clearly under pressure, and to maintain protocol while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. King Charles had remained involved in the development process, occasionally sitting in on training sessions and offering insights from the perspective of someone who had spent decades being recognized, protected, and served. His input had been particularly valuable in helping guards understand the human reality behind royal protection. Security is not about creating barriers, he would tell the trainees. It's about creating safe spaces where everyone can interact with dignity and respect. The king's approach to the entire situation had earned widespread admiration. Rather than expressing frustration or embarrassment about the incident, he had used it as an opportunity to improve royal security while demonstrating a very human response to an awkward moment. His patient good humor during the original encounter and his thoughtful follow-up with James have been seen as evidence of exactly the kind of accessible, modern monarchy that could maintain tradition while remaining relevant to contemporary British society. James's new role had also opened his eyes to the broader complexities of royal service. Working with security specialists, he learned about threat assessment, crowd psychology, and the delicate balance between public accessibility and personal safety that defined modern monarchy. He gained appreciation for the countless decisions, large and small, that went into protecting the royal family while allowing them to fulfill their public duties. The training program had produced measurable results. New guards reported feeling more confident in their ability to handle unexpected situations. There have been several instances where royalty had approached checkpoints in casual contexts, and guards had managed the encounters smoothly, recognizing their charges quickly while still following appropriate security procedures. The combination of improved recognition training and better psychological preparation had created a more robust and adaptable security system. James found particular satisfaction in working with guards who came from backgrounds similar to his own, young people from small towns and working-class families who had found their calling in royal service. He understood their nervousness, their desire to prove themselves worthy of the trust placed in them, and their fear of making the kind of mistake that could end their careers. Everyone makes mistakes, he would tell them. What matters is how you learn from them and how you use that learning to become better at your job. His own career trajectory had been permanently altered by those few minutes on a Tuesday morning, but in ways he was learning to appreciate. Instead of simply following orders and maintaining positions, he was now involved in shaping the future of royal protection. His insights were sought by senior officials, his training methods were being adopted by other security services, and his experience was contributing to a more thoughtful, human-centered approach to royal security. The incident had also strengthened his understanding of what service truly meant. It wasn't just about following rules or maintaining traditions. It was about upholding principles that sometimes required difficult decisions and uncomfortable moments. His willingness to apply security protocols consistently, even when faced with the monarch himself, had demonstrated a level of professional integrity that had ultimately enhanced rather than undermined the dignity of the institution he served. As James stood at his post on a crisp autumn morning exactly 1 year after the incident that had changed his life, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this point. The same determination that had carried him from a small Yorkshire town to the gates of St. James's Palace had helped him transform a moment of apparent failure into an opportunity for growth and contribution. The tourists gathering outside the palace gates looked at him with recognition now, some hoping to meet the famous guard who had stopped the king. James handled their attention with the same professionalism he brought to all aspects of his duties, understanding that he had become part of the story of modern monarchy, a symbol of the principle that true respect sometimes requires treating everyone equally, regardless of their titles or positions. His grandmother Edith had passed away 3 months earlier, but not before seeing her grandson receive a commendation for his contributions to royal security training. Her final words to him had been characteristically direct. "You've done something that will matter long after you're gone. Love. You've shown that doing right sometimes means standing up to power, even when power wears a crown." As James maintained his watch over the palace gates, he carried with him the knowledge that service was not about perfection, but about dedication to principles larger than oneself. The morning he had failed to recognize his king had taught him more about duty, respect, and honor than any textbook or training manual ever could. And in learning those lessons, he had helped ensure that future guards would be better prepared to serve with both competence and humanity, maintaining the highest standards of security while never forgetting that their ultimate duty was to the principles that made the monarchy worth protecting. The story of James Mitchell and King Charles had become part of royal folklore, a reminder that the most important moments often happen when protocol meets humanity, when duty encounters grace, and when people choose to see each other as human beings first and title second. In the end, it was a story not about failure or embarrassment, but about the transformative power of doing one's job with integrity, regardless of the consequences.